Hey, this is Brooke. I know this is a little unusual from our normal intro, but just wanted to let you know before we head into the episode about a new community that I'm starting up called Liberated Being. You can read all about it if you're intrigued at liberatedbeing.community. That's going to give you all the details. And also there's some ways to sign up for free information sessions about it, where I'm also going to be doing some practice with people. Those are going to be happening in February because it's open to its first group of members, February 1st to March 4th, because I'm a dork and I like the idea of all of us marching forth together on March 4th. So this is an online community, not a Facebook group. It's much more robust and warm than that. It connects people like us who are on the path that we talk about here on the show, and provides a lot of resources, primarily monthly live gatherings with really wonderful guest teachers. So it's like a little retreat you can go on without having to leave your home and be connected to these phenomenal people. And weekly live practices led by me. If you can't make it live, you get to have the recordings. And there's going to be a whole lot more going on in there as well. I am not letting you know about this because Bliss and Grit is ending at all. We are thrilled to be able to continue Bliss and Grit. This is the first of many offerings I'm sure that Vanessa and I will both offer. She's also working on her things as well. The reason why we went down to offering episodes once per month is so that we could have some time to work on these things that each of us knew we wanted to create. We're creative people by nature. So if you want to, again, check out this community that I'm opening up, it's liberatedbeing.community is the website. And if you want to make sure to not miss an episode, now that we are recording more like once a month, you can subscribe in whatever your podcast player is of choice. That way you won't miss any. And if you want to make sure to hear about things that Vanessa's creating, other things that I might be creating, who knows what we're going to come up with. I know that we've both been feeling the flow, feeling the inspiration. And the easiest place to hear about that is following us on social media or subscribing to our newsletter on our website, which is blissandgrit.com. So those are some ways you can stay in touch now that we just have a different rhythm and routine around here. And as we get more, hopefully really, really exciting and nourishing things together for this community of people here. All right. Without further ado, you know the routine on this show. We're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path. And what does that even mean? What's a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. And the last thing, sometimes we swear. So if you don't want those to be flying around, you might want to wear headphones. Okay, here we go. Hello, Vanessa.
Hello, Brooke.
It is so nice to be back with you. Now that we're on our once a month schedule, it feels like too long.
I know. It's been a hot minute.
Yeah.
I feel like we already recorded an episode just catching up.
Yeah, and we've recorded multiple episodes in regular old friend phone conversations where had we been recording, they would have actually worked.
It would have been amazing.
But, oh well, now we're actually recording. And we talk about and around and point at trauma a lot. Like it weaves into the work that we do here quite a lot. But I don't know if we've recorded an episode where we talk specifically about what's trauma. What's it feel like? How's it present? So maybe we can get into that a little bit this week.
Yeah. And as you say that, Brooke, I feel like, wow, I should have done a lot more homework for a conversation if we're going to pose it like that. But I do think we have some really interesting experience to share around trauma and how trauma can feel and how it could impact us. And not just from a psychological level, but also from a physiological level. And I think it could be interesting just to look at it a little bit from a mystical and spiritual level as well. And so don't take this as the guidebook to trauma. There are people having highly educated and informed conversations on it from a psychotherapeutic angle, but rather just a conversation for our community that's speaking about transformation and awakening. And what does it mean when we're really using these terms like PTSD or trauma And we're going to begin it with a really beautiful quote that Brooke's going to read to bring some heart into this exploration.
Yeah. And thank you for framing it that way. You know that this is the non-homework version of, we're not teaching a class, which we would prepare a lot more for. We're just having a conversation about how we talk about it and why we talk about it and what it is. So the quote that I'm going to read is from, I'm deeply in love right now with the book, The Choice by Dr. Edith Eva Eger. And it's pretty popular, so hopefully a lot of you listening are familiar with it. But it's the story of a woman who survived the Holocaust, and it's so much more than that. It's also her story of healing and assimilating to life in the U.S., becoming a mother of 3 children, and becoming a doctor of psychology, and her work with clients who are also healing from trauma. So it's a really, really, first of all, beautifully written, powerful story, but a wonderful tour through what is some of the worst heartbreak that human beings experience, and then what's healing look like. So this particular quote from the book is about the first time she's in the United States at this point, pretty newly immigrated. And it's the first time she has a flashback, but she doesn't know what it is. So I'm going to read it in a couple chunks. It's a long quote, but a good one, so it's worth it. So in this quote, she's just boarded a city bus in Baltimore without realizing she needs to put the coins in before she sits down. And she's done it the European way, where you sit down and wait for someone to come collect your tickets. So she says, I have forgotten to put my token in the change box. Now the bus driver is yelling at me, pay or get off, pay or get off. Even if I could speak English, I would not be able to understand him. I'm overcome by fear, by images of barbed wire and raised guns, by thick smoke rising from chimneys and obscuring my present reality, by the prison walls of the past closing in on me. And she goes on to say, now, my inner life makes me interpret a simple mistake, a misunderstanding, as catastrophe. Nothing in the present is really wrong. Nothing that can't be easily fixed. A man is angry and frustrated because he has misunderstood me, because I can't understand him. There's shouting and conflict, but my life's not in danger. And yet, this is how I read my present situation. Danger, danger, death. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit here. She goes on to talk about how she speaks with her sister about it after the incident. She says, I turned it into a joke, an episode of immigrant greener slapstick. But something changed in me that day. It will be more than 20 years before I will have the language and the psychological training to understand that I was having a flashback, that the unnerving physical sensations, racing heart, sweating palms, narrowing vision that I experienced that day, and that I will continue to experience many times in my life, even now, in my late 80s, are automatic responses to trauma. This is why I now object to pathologizing post-traumatic stress by calling it a disorder. It's not a disordered reaction to trauma. It's a common and natural one. But on that November morning in Baltimore, I didn't know what was happening to me. I assumed that my collapse meant that I was deeply flawed. I wish I had known that I wasn't a damaged person, that I was suffering the fallout of an interrupted life.
Oh my God.
This book. I've shed a lot of tears with this book. It's gorgeous. Yeah. But that last line in particular, and this is always my wish from my heart for anyone who's experienced trauma or flashbacks, to know that they're not a damaged person. There's been such a long history, I think, born out of fear and confusion, that trauma means you're broken, that the symptoms of trauma mean you're broken. And I love her reframe, like, it doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you have a disorder. It means you're having a very natural, normal, albeit unpleasant, obviously, response to a person who's, in her words, whose life was interrupted.
Wow. It is so powerful as well, because whatever the level of trauma you've experienced in your life, I think one aspect of trauma I'm very familiar with is this turning away from the self. right? This kind of self-abnegation or this self-condemnation that can just be born out of feelings of shame or born out of a need to turn on yourself because you think that makes you safe with others, or, all the different places that it comes from. But I think it's a very familiar experience for people who have histories of trauma, that they find themselves ashamed of who they are or ashamed of what they go through. And so if you add to that a cultural stigmatization around the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, it's just a recipe for a nightmare, as many of us have experienced. It's just a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe, speaking a little bit, sort of zooming in a bit on what she was talking about, the physiological responses. Like there's a trigger, that word's been sort of destroyed. There's a trigger. There's something that sets off a response. So suddenly you're not in the present moment. You're interpreting everything through the lens of something that happened in the past. So as she was saying, simple misunderstanding. A man's angry, but my life's not at risk in this situation, but she falls to the ground and she really feels that this is death, that level of danger. So the body responds as if there's a fear of death, imminent threat to the survival of the being, racing heart, sweating palms, and this can go many different ways, right? It can go into freeze, shut down, or panic. And that if we can get some familiarity around it, and I really like the way Peter Levine, who is for the creator of SomaticExperiencing, which is a really wonderful trauma recovery, obviously somatic body-based, the way he talks about this as a charge. Like I find that in and of itself is destigmatizing, right? Because it's not like, oh, something happened to you, and so now you're damaged forever. Instead, it's like, oh, something happened. There was too large of a charge in your body to be metabolized at that time because the body and the being was directly under threat. And so life goes on, but the charge is still there, trapped in the nervous system. And it's just a beautiful, it's taken me actually years. I've been familiar with Peter Levine's work for 23 years. I read it when I was training at the Rolf Institute for a long time. It's taken me that amount of time to start to get how liberating a viewpoint that is. Because it's not, as somebody who grew up with trauma and some of the things that you could tell as stories of trauma, this thing happened to me. You're always under it's like, well, that happened to me. So now I'm just the person who that happened to forever. Nothing can ever erase it. It's a part of my story. And so I'm like this now is sort of the frame that we get culturally about trauma. But if it's like, oh, right, life-threatening things happen to many, many of us, horrifying, terrible things, abuse, but also including neglect, which the body interprets as trauma, interestingly. And it creates a charge in the nervous system because it wants to survive. That's its job, get to safety and survive. But it can't, in that circumstance, change or alter the course of that moment. So the charge remains, even though life goes on. Yeah,
it's almost like it can't mobilize itself in the way that it would spontaneously, whether that would be to cry in that moment, to run in that moment, to yell in that moment. It seems to me like it's almost like the spontaneous reaction had to be halted in favor of survival. And it's like the charge of that is part of what's staying around, as well as the tremendous feelings you might have had in a moment that were too big to be integrated into a nervous system.
Right. And then suddenly it becomes, I'm a person with some charges in my nervous system that I'm finding ways to metabolize and express and discharge, as opposed to I'm the person who this thing happened to. And so I am, I have a disorder because of it.
Yeah, disorder has such a final quality to it, doesn't it? Yeah. I almost imagine that the evolution of the term, and I don't actually know, but I imagine it was part of an attempt to understand and shine a light on why some people seem to react one way and some people seem to react another way.
Truly.
And to open up compassion for this is just a disorder. You should have empathy. But I hope and I believe that the consciousness is evolving and we're starting to have such a more nuanced, subtle understanding of the human experience and what it means to be in this human body. And I hope with that, we realize we don't have to label it as something in order to have understanding or compassion. We can really just be in relationship to someone's alive experience.
Yeah.
And understand if they're going through something. It's never because they're broken. I think that's probably part of the fundamental reality that you and I bring into it from that spiritual perspective, which is, I believe that people want to be well. And if they're not feeling good or healthy, something's happening for them. Just as simple as that, right? Someone wants to be at ease, right? Someone wants to feel good about themselves. Someone wants to be in love. These things are our natural desires, and someone's full of that potentiality. And if that's not arising, if they're in a different state, well, something's going on for them, and we don't need to label it as a disorder in order to get that and have empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. Even just calling it post-traumatic stress is just very straightforward.
Right. Something happened.
Yeah. Something happened.
It deeply affected me.
Yeah. And I think that probably your intuition's right. It was, I don't know the history. Again, I haven't done my homework. I don't know the history of the creation of post-traumatic stress disorder as a term, or as something that was being looked for. I'm going to guess, a lot of veterans were coming back from probably World War I, and they were seeing a lot of people kind of go about their lives. And again, who knows, right? Were they only raging at their children and spouse, but they functioned great at work, so they didn't get a label. And some people couldn't rejoin the normal rhythm of life at all. And so there had to be this reckoning with some people have a disorder. But when we see it from a much more see all the waves of subtlety in this, it's some people had a more resilient system. And sometimes I can get very formulaic about that. And I've found to not totally trust that, but
yeah, I'm not sure I agree with it either. It's interesting that
the formulaic thought is people who had very loving, highly attuned, nurturing parents, may have experienced something horrible in World War I, but they had resilience in the system. And there's a way that makes perfect sense. I think that that's correct. I think there's an intelligence to it. But as soon as we start slicing it up into these very neat formulas about who got what, there's so much about our personalities and perspectives and all the subtle nuances of our personal histories and our lineage. Were we just born into a really high-strung lineage like I was? And that changes the way you view things. So I don't want to make it so, here's the answer. Here's why. Some people dealt with it better and some people dealt with it worse. Because I do think there's, we can get too focused on the figuring out which is not that interesting because it's like, are people just shifting? Is the charge discharging? The end.
Yeah, I'm not sure it really adds up appropriately either. And sometimes, like, let's say you look at family systems and you look at different siblings, some siblings can go through very similar circumstances. There's always differences because of birth order and, personal lives, but you can look at siblings and say they all can respond really differently. And for example, I've looked at some siblings where one is really grappling. They're very aware that they're grappling with this PTS. They're having physiological flashbacks, or they're having difficulty in, let's say, being intimate with people, even though they want to. And then another sibling will seem as if they had no impact, but perhaps they have health issues. Mm-hmm. Perhaps they're just completely compartmentalized and shut down. But if you were to ask them, they would say, my childhood was fine.
Yeah.
Right. So the more important part is looking at like what effect these kind of tragic, either acute or chronic developmental types of traumas can create on a human being. I mean, it's like what it can do to our minds and what it can do to our bodies. And I think, when you speak about flashbacks, I remember being younger, and I guess the first time you do hear about this term, at least when we were younger, right? I'm hoping our culture is catching up a little bit, but was when you were speaking about vets or something like that, and just the kinds of things that they were grappling with. And I remember hearing about flashbacks, and I pictured it just as like this visual thing, like almost like they saw themselves there in a moment. And in the meantime, I had no idea that I was having flashbacks all the time.
Yeah. And
that what it meant for me was that this kind of normal everyday incident that she was describing, like you get on the bus, someone's upset with you. It's no big deal. You can work it out. There's nothing really at stake. Were happening. And my physiology was responding as if I was back in a really big moment of crisis that I've experienced before, right? That I was back under that same level of threat. I had no idea that it was a flashback and that it was related to this kind of active charge or unprocessed event. I would think things like, I'm an anxious person. Yeah. I can't tolerate stress. I don't know how to tolerate difficult situations, right? It's almost like the first thing we do, bless us, right? In an attempt to try to make sense out of our own reality, because no one's having these educated conversations, or at least they weren't when I was younger, was we try to understand ourselves, right? But the perspective with which we're bringing to bear upon ourselves is going to define what we're capable of seeing. So if I'm bringing a perspective like no one else goes through this, people don't go through this, and like I don't understand what can happen as a result of trauma, then when I look at it, I'm applying all these labels. Oh, well, you're anxious, you're less functional than others, you're too sensitive. And again, this is how it becomes so stigmatized, right? We begin to think, I am this, rather than these things that are arising in me are a natural result of an active charge on a very traumatic experience that needs to be held and released in love and in movement and in all these other ways that we know can help with trauma now.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. And the big question I feel like that gets inserted there is just in general, what's wrong with me? And I know that some people don't love, and, including me, depending on the day, but this sort of like trauma is up in the culture, right? Like we're talking about it, we're talking about what it is and how to heal from it, which is wonderful. And some people are like, okay, everybody's got trauma, everybody. And it's like, well, kind of. I mean, our culture's not the most intact culture. Like there's something really strange about a culture of separation that believes in stories like survival of the fittest, or it's a dog eat dog world, or it's not going to develop the most open-handed nervous systems ever. So kinda like we're all dealing with some of this.
Listen, there are clearly degrees, and there are clearly, depending on what you've been exposed to, I mean, man, right? It can like hijack your system. It can hijack your life. I mean, depending on what you've been through and the severity of it, the effects that it can have on your physiology alone can just be massive. And if you've had a slighter version of trauma, you know, with enough love in the house, it's not going to be exactly the same. Mm-hmm. But if we start to look at trauma from a couple of ways, like one, kind of like something that happened in the past isn't getting filed into the past. In other words, it feels to the body mind as if the past is still happening in the present because you never could close a file on something. Mm-hmm. If we look at it from that definition, and that's just one way to look at it, we could say, yes, most of us are experiencing something where we think the past is still happening and we don't recognize that we're in a fresh new moment where new possibilities exist for us. So to some degree, we may all relate with that. If your past, though, was a living, waking nightmare, that's going to have a much different effect on you than if your past maybe was one where you just felt alone, which hell is a really painful experience, but you may not be walking around thinking that someone's going to target you at any second in the same way, right? So there are degrees. I think as well, you know, we can, forget it. I was just going to say something new about trauma, but my brain spaced because one of the things that was coming into my mind, Brooke, just to add to that part of the conversation, was I remember hearing, I think it was Irene Lyon in an interview with somebody, and the guy was from Europe, and he was talking like kind of what you said, like, is everybody traumatized? Like, come on. Like, this is like popular parlance, which honestly is fair because it's almost like if you don't recognize the spectrum, you're almost invalidating people who've been through capital T trauma by making it like everybody's had trauma. So there's a complexity here. But what she was saying, and she's like, listen, I get what you're saying. But if we're honest and we look at the research and we look at the physiological impact, people who've had developmental trauma, which is most people, as you said, we're
attuned caregivers, culture that doesn't feel like there's safety in it inherently.
Separation, lineage issues, all of these different things, even just, you know, your family demanding collectivism over your own happiness, like these kinds of things can just be read as traumas. And she said, if we look physiologically, yes, it's the same. Yeah. And that's crazy, right? That took me a long time to get, like you were saying, like it took you a while to realize how powerful what Peter Levine was offering. Like it took me a while to really let register that the limbic brain could perceive, let's say, interpersonal threat, being kicked out of the tribe, not being liked, not being loved, not being valued, this kind of interpersonal threat. It could weigh it as heavy as, you know, physical threat or emotional threat. Like that was really interesting to me because I think in my mind, there's got to be a hierarchy, right? Like
it's amazing how much we go to hierarchy all the time, right? Like that's another one of those cultural layers. Well, what's the important kind or the highest kind or the worst kind? Actually, it's one of the things I really appreciated about the book, The Choice, is that one of the things that's woven through the whole book, but one of the larger sections is she's talking about her work with her clients. So she's talking about doing trauma recovery work with clients, primarily clients, American clients who she was working with in Texas. And she's talking about where she lived at the time, the spectrum of that. And it was just such a compassionate view. It didn't have any of what I call the suffering pissing contest in it, right? Like, what's the hierarchy here? Who's really suffering? Who's really allowed to suffer? Who's suffering the worst? She was saying, you know, on one given day, I might have one client, and I'm misquoting here, but something along the lines of one client who is inconsolably weeping because the car they ordered was delivered in the wrong color. And another client who is so near death from anorexia and abuse. And she's like, they're not, she didn't say they're the same, but she's like, these are just suffering people, and their suffering is real. Like when they're feeling the suffering, what they're feeling is suffering. We don't need to rank the important kind of suffering. It's such a funny veil that we all wear. Like, where do we put that? And I see it's really important to hold certain things as crucial to the conversation of healing culture. So I'm not saying we chuck all of that out the window and like, hey, if somebody's losing their mind over the color of the paint on their car, I get it.
Yeah.
that's equal to, some of the horrors that people really experience. But there was just something really, really open-hearted and really humanizing about like suffering. A charge is a charge. And so the question isn't, are they allowed to, or even what's wrong with them and how bad is it? It's just, how do we discharge the charge so that the person can come here and arrive in this moment and experience life, get caught up to the present tense and really have life back instead of whatever file keeps cropping up and playing through the lens of it's still happening.
Well, I think you're speaking like a practitioner, right? You're speaking like an experiencer, which is what the author was also speaking as, right? Because if we were to just speak as, let's say, a psychoeducator or, a theorist, well, then it's important to delineate that there are some things that people go through that even interfere with their everyday functioning. And that is a different experience than someone wigging out over a paint color, for sure. And from a theorist point of view, we'll lay out all that information. But as a practitioner, as somebody who's working with people and working with ourselves as a self-practitioner, what is important is there's suffering here. There's charge here. Something is showing up here. Some memory is being pulled. Some wound is being showed, and some hurt wants to be met. Right, wants to be met in a way it's never been met before. Either finally giving the freedom to let it move, right? It's like, this is the kind of work, somatic experiencing, maybe they're going to shake it out. In Judith Blackstone's work, it may be a more subtle release of contraction, right? But either finally allowing something to move that has been immobilized or contracted, or meeting the pain with what was needed in that moment so desperately that was never received. For example, I had a memory I was working with recently, something that happened between me and one of my parents. And what I didn't know I needed until I was working with it directly was I needed somebody to hug me so close and then say to me, it's okay if you're imperfect. You get to be imperfect. You don't have to do anything. I love you no matter what, right? And it was almost like, so what was coming up from that memory? It was fear. It was shame. It was anger. It was terror from the way I was being treated, right? And the antidote was there was a part of me that almost like fragments off and comes to believe the experience I'm having, whatever anger someone was projecting at me, that my parent was projecting at me, or whatever frustration they were having, that they were upset with my results, whatever that was, I began to take it on and I began to believe, well, then I am shameful. Well, I better do a better job. Well, I am someone to be angry at, right? And it's like that way that like these traumatic moments, they kind of store with a belief, they store with kind of an identity structure almost, a somatic feeling. And that whole complex got stored in me. So when I could kind of see the memory up close that was creating this charge in my life, I could see like, wow, what I really needed was this. Right. And that's different than a somatic approach. A somatic approach might be get up and mobilize and do something else. That's also beautiful. This is just what I was working with at the time. And I got to see like, okay, so then I could imagine myself being hugged. And you know what? That feels pretty good, actually, even just to imagine it. And then I could tell myself these things that I never heard. And it just starts to create an opening in the nervous system. It began to create an opening in my body. And listen, one time, that is not enough. I've needed to work with this. I work with this. I give myself the words that I didn't get. But it's almost like a way of loosening up that trauma reaction that I'm calling. It's almost like an identity got formed in that fragmented moment where I just couldn't be my spontaneous self. And I'm just beginning to meet that and say, hey, you're really okay. Hey, you're safe with me. Hey, I love you. Hey, you don't need to be perfect, which I didn't know. But apparently that part of me got the memo. It did. Until I kind of got closer, I didn't see. So like there's this kind of beautiful, alive process where it can start to loosen over time, either through moving in a way it never moved before, or being met with love and care and thoughtfulness, or even maturity. Like even if someone needs to say something really wonderful, like it's important you do good at school, but you could only give it your best, maturity, so that it can start to, I think, relax the charge. Mm-hmm. I think all of them do that.
Yeah. And what I've found for myself, I think one of the reasons why this conversation is hopefully useful for people is that as I become more aware of the charge and as charges and I work with them more, first of all, like part of what you're describing, these identities, this conditioning that got hooked in there can go, and I start to experience my life differently. I don't have to see it through that viewpoint of in that example, should be doing better or working harder. Mm-hmm. But also just being able to be aware, because a trauma response is very fast. Like it's way below the level of consciousness. It's something hits a tender point and the whole chain of events physiologically is on. But what I found is that even though that still happens sometimes, there is an observer self most of the time. I wouldn't say always, but the vast majority of the time, which is like a huge win, So there's the me that's experiencing the reaction, and there's the me, the wise self, the higher self, the observer self, that can go, oh, reaction. Reaction is happening right now. Mm-hmm. And that really, really changes things relationally with myself and in the world. Because there's a few things I know about when I am in a response and I'm not thinking clearly. I'm not really aware of everything that's going on in the present moment. My perception is going to be limited. And everything is it is going to feel like a life or death situation or a catastrophe, in some way, shape, or form. But if I can observe that, then the autopilot doesn't just bite me and the world in the ass all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, well, there's a reaction here. It will pass. And as soon as I can have that kind of relationship to it, it's already passing. Like I'm not going to be just reacting from that place, but I can do things like, now is not the time to write an email or make a phone call, right, or make a big decision, right, or go out and party with friends, though I do that very rarely these days. Like now is the time to just let the charge pass. And that is, some of what we were talking about before we started recording. Like a lot of this is, how do we develop a reparenting relationship with ourselves so that, yes, the response happens, but we're not, it's funny for people who started out doing all this, non-dual podcasting, which I think we're still very much in that space. Sometimes it's really helpful to think about splitting yourself into the one having the reaction and the one who is the wisest self, deep being, the more like ideal nurturer, parental self, so that these charges can get worked out in a dynamic and you're not just stuck seeing the world through the lens of the one who's in a reaction.
I think it's just instrumental. I haven't found a different way to work with it, because otherwise what it's felt like to me is you're lost in it. Like I said, if we just imagined, we could call it a pattern, but these kinds of patterns that can arise in trauma, they seem to have beliefs, they seem to have thoughts, they seem to have feelings. It's like the whole shebang arises, and, you may be believing you're worthless and then feeling just deep terror and shame, and, all these things come at once. And if I'm identified with the pattern that's rising, that's it. I just have to ride it out till it passes. And in the process of writing it out till it passes, I may misunderstand it because I think it's me. I think it's reality. I think I am unworthy. So maybe I'll get back together with that abusive boyfriend, or maybe I will, rage at my boss until I get fired. Like all of these things can happen. But I think when you can recognize yourself as the witness, or we could call it reparenting, or we could call it, like Matt Kahn says, being the angel for the body that you have, right? Like whatever it is, we can start to realize this isn't me. This is a reaction rising up within me. And that's the same freedom you talked about at the beginning, Brooke, right? Like if it's PTS, not PTSD, if it's a charge, well, these things can pass. This isn't who I am. And I think what's wild, having gone through like a nervous system retraining, a limbic retraining kind of program, was I didn't realize earlier how much of what I thought was me was a trauma reaction, right? Was an activated limbic loop where you were just chronically feeling unsafe because your physiology was being stimulated into states of unsafety. Then you walk around the world and you think, as I said before, I am an anxious person. I am a shamed person. I am. So then you just assume, well, no one else seems to be like this. I must have a problem. And this is kind of the collateral damage, if you will, of this kind of, traumatic experiences that we can have. So I think when we understand the types of things that we're talking about, at least there's no collateral damage added. We're not misunderstanding ourselves. We're not moving into judgment about ourselves. Like I had a trigger this week and I was just fascinated to notice, like, it's going to sound like a duh, right? Like here's a Godoy, but I was fascinated to really see it does not matter how much I cognitively understand that I am safe and fine at all. Like it at all to my physiology. My heart is still racing. It's still pounding. I'm still flushing. My sympathetic nervous system is still dominant. Like it doesn't matter to the physiology that I cognitively know better. And so we have to go to the physiology first. And that's one of the things that I think is really important. Perspective is so, so helpful. But I think often perspective, either we don't have the capacity to have the kind of perspective when we're in a trauma response that will calm us. Perhaps that can come from a helpful practitioner that we're working with. Or perspective alone just isn't enough, because first we have to calm down that limbic loop. Mm-hmm. But if we don't even have space from that experience, we don't even know that we can slow down, we can calm the limbic loop, we wait to send the email, like you said, this isn't who I am, this is an experience that's rising within me, this is a memory of shame, whether it's intergenerational, cultural, personal, and I'm going to breathe more, And I'm going to do all of these compassionate techniques, whether somatic or imaginative, like I was describing before with memory, to begin to let my body know, because it doesn't, because it's caught in time. It's almost as if you can think of it like your body is caught in a moment of time.
Yeah.
That happened already. And I need to let my body update to safety. We have so many episodes on this. Like we're like a file bank for how to update to safety.
Right. That's a deep love of ours for sure. And I just want to make sure to bring in also something we've spoken about a lot that we're passionate about, but I think it's important in these conversations to bring up that we're not chasing perfection, right? We're not chasing excellence of the one who is always in equanimity, who's never triggered, who's always just endlessly, delighted or open-hearted or whatever particular narrative we have, or like grounded or mature. We're people. Actually, it was Jane Clapp who we had on the show once. She had a great post on Instagram this week about that. Like,
I saw that one. It was great.
It was so good. How do you feel in your body when you think about the word regulated? Like, I need to make sure my nervous system's regulated. Like, does it make you feel more alive? And it's like, no. We have so much to experience here in a human body. We get to experience excitement and joy and grief and heartbreak and inspiration and boredom. Like there's so many experiences we get to have. So we're not trying to close the spectrum to some kind of acceptable robot person way to be. And that we know that we finally crossed the healing finish line when we just are totally unflappable. Like that's not what we're going for. But wouldn't it be great if we could have this kind of relationship that we're describing to the state, that we aren't the state is a charge, and that there are other aspects of self that can observe the charge, that can reparent the self, and that the less we're caught with the file cabinet being stuck in the past, the more we actually can have our spontaneous aliveness, the more of whatever wants to come forward in the present moment. Maybe it's lust, maybe it's delight, maybe it's shock, maybe you watch someone fall off their bike in the middle of the street and you go, ugh, and you really feel it, That's what we want to be connected to, is that we can really be here, not that we can, be here in this very acceptable, tidied up, I'm the perfect one
robot,
right? Because I don't really get triggered by things.
Yes, it took us forever to embrace the concept of aliveness and being alive, actually, but it is certainly part of the alive experience. Not that trauma feels alive, because that certainly has this feeling of holy hell, I am really caught in something. And I like what you said there, Brooke. I loved that post by Jane Clapp. And I think the other thing I just want to make sure we say, which again, we say all the time, but you never know when someone's tuning in the first time, and it's so important. These things do happen less and less. Thank God. We do get more and more functioning. We do get more and more capable. We do get more and more courageous to be able to move through things and really honestly do things differently. That's kind of like one of the beautiful things we have an opportunity to, like, this time I'm going to breathe differently. I'm just going to breathe deep, or I'm going to go ahead and say that thing that's been so scary for me, or I'm going to go ahead and actually date someone, even though that's really, really hard on me. We do have the capacity grow within us to do things differently, which ultimately will bring a different experience of life for us. But in these kinds of contracted states that come and go, right? They come and go. I often can't always see my way through on my own. And it doesn't mean every single time I have a contracted state, I call a therapist or I run out to a practitioner. But if they're happening regularly enough, if they're not like, just these rare waves in the ocean, when they were happening regularly for both of us, we got help, right? Because even though we're talking about there is always this observing self, and there is, even when I was lost in the identity, this is me, I'm broken, I'm a mess, there is still an observing self. That's how I can remember all of that. But I couldn't get quite enough space from it. I couldn't get quite enough distance. It would be like if a voice came up in my mind saying like, oh, you should be ashamed of yourself. Let's say that was part of how that pattern played out. My observing self would kind of be like, yeah,
right.
I should be.
Let's really whip that shame up into a frenzy.
Sounds right. Yeah. Right. Like there just wasn't enough space from it. At this point, if a voice comes up that's like, you should be ashamed of yourself, I'm like, really? Kind of that sounds true, but mostly I'm betting no, there's nothing for me to be ashamed of. So that's interesting. Why is shame here? And so it's a different experience, which makes it more workable on my own. And even still, I reach out for support. But depending on the place that you're in, this idea of reparenting sometimes is too hard to initiate on your own. And I think for many of us, we develop the capacity to reparent because someone is showing us what a healthy, helpful figure could look or feel like.
For sure.
In whatever form that practitioner comes for you, whether it's a trauma therapist or somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. Good advice, always to reach out and get support when you need it. And go read The Choice by Dr. Edith Eva Eger.
Yeah, that's great. And I feel like if we don't end it on just highlighting the beginning, like the quote you shared in the beginning, I just wanted to choke cry. It was so touching.
I know, it was hard to read it. It's so beautiful. The whole book is so beautiful.
And if we don't bring it home by reinforcing again, there is nothing wrong with you. You are not damaged. You are not broken. You are not unredeemable. There's nothing wrong with you. You are perfect, and there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of help. And this is just one part of that. And we love you.
Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we're at a new pace now. So we're putting out episodes about once a month. The easiest way to make sure you don't miss one is to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you want to hear about all the goings on, the reasons why we're down to once a month, which is so that Vanessa and I can both make goodies, make more, not less, to support all of you. You can do that at blissandgrit.com, where you can subscribe, and that way we'll send out emails when something new is percolating. Social media is a good place to find us too. I happen to have something opening up, the Liberated Being community, February 1st to March 4th, so for the first group of members. So if you want more information, there's going to be lots of opportunities to learn all about it and ask me questions, and that is at liberatedbeing.community. So not .com, but .community. All right, we'll be back in about a month, and thank you so much for all the support. It means so much to us to hear from all of you.